Hi, and welcome to this week's edition of Process, the National Security Program at ThePrint, where we talk about the big event of the week. And this week, we're looking at the ongoing G20 summit meeting in Srinagar. Not a big summit meeting in itself. It's about tourism, but obviously important what's happening simply because it's happening in that city. Joined by the scholar Tricia Bacon, who watches all things India, Pakistan, and terrorism. Thank you for making the time, Tricia. And by my colleague Snehesh Alex Philip, who's actually in Srinagar. So Snehesh, tell us what it's like, this first event after Article 370 was ended and a huge sort of landmark event.
Well, absolutely, Praveen. This is a big event as far as the J&K government is concerned, or the administration is concerned, as far as even the Indian government is concerned. As you rightly mentioned, this is the first major international event that is being held since the abrogation of Article 370. Now, the administration has gone all out of the way to woo the foreign delegates here. This is the G20 summit. There are over 100 delegates who have come to attend this particular event. There's also an opportunity to showcase to the world that Kashmir is stable, contrary to what many would want to assume, what would say. The J&K administration wants to show that everything is calm, the people are living a normal life, the streets are full of people. In the evenings and all, shikara rides were organized for the delegates to showcase them the cultural part of the Kashmir life itself. The markets, the Polo View market here has been completely spruced up. It looks completely decked up with new footpaths, with new lights and things like that. So the administration has gone really out of the way. At the same time, for the delegates who have been given a very royal welcome, with all the band, baja, barat that one could actually think of. The security is also of a prime concern. The administration has gone ahead and deployed massive amount of security. The Marcos, the specialized naval commandos, have been brought in. The Para-SF, the RR units, as the Rashtriya Rifle units, have been deployed. Interesting facet of the thing is that, except for finding the cops, if you enter Srinagar, one would ideally see the ugly security barracks on the road. For the G20 summit, all these barracks have been actually covered with nice, pretty-looking G20 posters. So except for the few cops that you'll find on the road or the barricades, things look absolutely calm and nice.
So great for the delegates, Snehesh. Are ordinary people also equally thrilled by this? Do they see this as a landmark, or are people you speak to worried and concerned about what comes next? What's under all the pretty makeup, if that's one way of putting it?
Well, I spoke to a number of people. They were they were saying that this G20 summit should have been postponed. The reason why they wanted to be postponed was that they felt that more beautification projects would have been carried out for the G20 summit. Had it been delayed by a month or so, Srinagar would have looked like a completely different city. But at the end of the day, the Srinagar economy is basically based on tourism. So while G20 summit per se doesn't help them in terms of tourism, except for the Lilith hotel that they're staying in and the government administration, what they're hopeful is that more and more people will come. So one of the primary focus of the G20 summit is to showcase Kashmir as a film destination. I spoke to Minister of State in the PMO, Jitendra Singh. I spoke to the tourism minister. Then we had a small interaction with the Lieutenant Governor. And the primary focus of the entire thing is to showcase this as a film destination. Now, Jitendra Singh was saying that, you don't have to, Kashmir offers you valley, it offers you meadows, it offers you lake, it offers you mountains. So you don't have to look at different places to shoot. Remember that till the 1980s, Kashmir used to be a favorite destination for Bollywood films. But over the last 4 decades, because of terrorism and things like that, Kashmir has fallen off from the filmmaking map. The administration says that in the last 1 year, there are over 300 shoots that have taken place involving films and also TV serials. But they really want to promote this as a tourism hub. And precisely for this reason, while it's a G20 summit, remember that the major G20, some of the G20 countries like China, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia have kept out of the G20 meet. They have not registered for the event. which means that unofficially officially they're not taking part. But then both Turkey and Saudi Arabia have sent in their trade delegations. Now, what I mean by trade delegations are tourist groups. So in the G20 meet per se, of course, there is a Turkey flag which is there, and there is a Saudi flag which is there. But when I asked this question to both the tourism minister as well as Jitendra Singh, they said that, one should not really focus on who have not taken part in the official capacity. The flag is still there. And their argument is that the G20 meet, the tourism is the primary focus here. And tourism is at the end of the day run by private enterprises, tour operators. And it's important that they have come. So the people here are hoping that while the G20 itself might not bring in the revenue, is that it will at least open up to the world for more tourists to come in. And that is something that they are really hoping for.
Fantastic, Snehesh. Thank you for bringing us that glimpse from the ground. And that's a great lead-in to you, what I want to ask you about, Tricia. Has the West decided that it's time to make its peace with the reality of post-Article 370 Kashmir? Because at this G70 summit, we do see most Western countries and governments represented in one form or the other, only China staying out. But would Western governments, do you think, like this to be something that's consigned to history now?
I think it's probably still an issue in most of the governments in the West, but it has really fallen in the agenda, right? The priority now is building relations with India, improving bilateral relations, whether it to sort of balance against China or as a sort of economic power. So I think it's one of those issues that is brought up more privately now than it once was. It's brought up in less high profile sort of meetings and visits. And so it's sort of been pushed to the back burner. I don't know that it will entirely have fallen off, but it's not a defining issue in India's relationship with the West the way that at times it was over the past couple of decades.
In the past, at many times, we've seen India push for some form of recognition of this kind. We saw in the 1950s this Indian push to get the Soviet leadership to visit Kashmir and recognize its sort of post-constitutional integration in India. Even the Grand Imam of Mecca was brought to Srinagar in the 1980s. Are these visits things that have genuine geopolitical significance, or are they more by the way of, should we see them more by the way of theatrical illustrations, if you like, of changing times and power, or as substantial sort of declarations of geopolitical belief and intent?
I think that having the meeting there was a savvy move by the Indian government, in that by going to this meeting, there is a sort of de facto acceptance by most of the G20 of the situation in Jammu and Kashmir. So I think it was somewhere in between the two things that you've described. And in a way, it was a way to get a stamp of acceptance of the situation by most of the international community, which had largely sort of been silent and not opposed the changes since 2019, but hadn't necessarily proactively recognized them in some way. And by holding this meeting in Srinagar, the Indian government has been able to get sort of that quiet de facto acceptance of the situation.
Right. One of the things that interested me in this was that, Chinese opposition to holding the meeting in Srinagar, not a surprise. They've said it many times. Turkey also, yes, had issues around this. But Saudi Arabia has been a country Prime Minister Narendra Modi's invested a great deal in trying to build a relationship in. And while we saw the UAE show up and Indonesia, Bangladesh show up, Saudi Arabia staying away formally is a little bit of a mystery. Does that tell us that in parts of the Middle East, Kashmir is still a live issue that governments there need to be sensitive about?
I think that there's sort of a bundle of issues that have come together now. I think, yes, what you're pointing to, there is still a desire to for Saudi Arabia to show itself as a leader of the Muslim world. And this is an issue that falls under that. And of course, Saudi Arabia has historically had a close relationship with Pakistan. But I also think this is a lot about China. And Saudi Arabia has invested quite a bit in improving relations with India, but it's also growing its ties with China. So it was able to sort of bundle those issues together and not come and it checks all of those boxes. But I don't know if one of those individual reasons would have been enough rather than all of them together that it was willing to take this move.
The big question, of course, everyone who follows Kashmir, I think, is asking themselves is there's complete chaos in Pakistan. Since 2019, things have been relatively quiet in Kashmir, at least partly because the Pakistan army has kept the peace. You've had a ceasefire on the line of control, infiltration has been low, terrorist groups have been reined in. As someone looking at what's happening in Pakistan, are you concerned that we might not be able to assume that the peace is held, that things might end up deteriorating in coming months?
I am concerned about that. That would be the sort of probability, in my view, of where we are heading. I think there's too many factors that have now been changed with the unrest in Pakistan. I think one of the issues is that the groups that have been restrained might see an opening where they can take action without the army paying enough attention to be able to stop it. I think there may be elements of the army or of ISI who want to undertake more activities in Kashmir and who haven't been happy with the policy, and they may see an opening to conduct some kind of action in Kashmir. And it has largely been sort of a tactical shift on the side of the Pakistani army in terms of how they've reined in the groups. We haven't seen that they've really dismantled them. So there is still enough capability there, especially for the two major groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, that I could see a world in which this presents an opening to sort of challenge that policy, which they undoubtedly have been dissatisfied with since 2019. So I do think that we see a potential window of concern here.
So two questions then, should that come about. And the first would be, how do you believe the United States would react to a heating up of the line of control? In a way, the United States has been the de facto or the behind the scenes guarantor of this quiet. Tons and tons of other things now going on, a crisis in Ukraine, containment of China. Do you believe the United States would be willing to step up, able to step up to tamp down a potential crisis breaking out again?
I think that we are in a transition period for the U.S. role and trying to understand how this will look in the kind of new era of geopolitics that we're experiencing. I think the U.S. would be willing to do so, in part because it would undoubtedly be important to India, and the U.S. seems to really be investing in improving that partnership. I think the other side of it is the U.S. has taken a very hands-off approach to the situation in Pakistan and basically to the relationship with Pakistan since the withdrawal in 2021. And there's not a lot of appetite in Washington to engage with the Pakistanis. But this would be the kind of thing that probably the U.S. would be willing to push the Pakistanis on if we see an escalation of violence in Kashmir and the Indian reaction to it. I think that there is concern in Washington that if Kashmir and sort of the Pakistan line of control heats up, that distracts India from what the U.S. wants it to focus on, which is China. So from that perspective, I think the U.S. might be more willing to engage in that traditional role and more willing to push the Pakistanis than they have been in the recent past 2.5 years.
The second part of that question is, if you were advising Prime Minister Modi on these events, a general election coming up around a year away, there have already been a couple of bloody strikes where Indian troops have been killed in ambushes in Poonch, not far from the line of control. Either of those events could easily have led to, to larger numbers of Indian security force casualties. And as the election draws, there will undoubtedly be pressure on the Prime Minister to repeat what was done in 2018 and strike across the line of control. So I'm asking you a question I guess no one has an answer to, which is, what do you think the Indian threshold is for this? And how, in your view, ought India actually deal with a crisis of that kind should it erupt, bearing in mind the way things are going in Pakistan?
Yeah, it is a very difficult question. I think that there were a number of years where, at least on the US side, there was an understanding of what the Indian threshold was. And that has become much less clear in recent years when India will respond militarily. And to your point, if an attack takes place, it's not easy to finally calibrate the success of an attack. Sometimes attacks are less successful and sometimes they're more successful. And so in the face of this uncertainty about the Indian threshold, there is, I think, a lot of room for error in terms of these attacks being significantly more successful than they've been in the past. Some kind of Indian strike into Pakistan in the midst of this instability might have some unintended consequences. In part, it allows the Pakistani military to reiterate its primary role as the protector of Pakistan from India. So it might actually sort of inadvertently affirm how the Pakistani army wants to present itself, an image that is under a lot of stress in Pakistan right now. So it might not have the intended consequences. And I think the other piece of it is we are in a window where there could be action in Pakistan that wouldn't necessarily have been sanctioned by the Pakistani army. And so that sort of retaliation may not be sort of punishing the actor who has sort of undertaken the decision. And so that's another piece of the calibration of it. And I do think that we are in a situation where in the last crisis, the US didn't take a primary role until it started to escalate. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how the US will handle future crises like that, whether it will encourage or at least silently encourage the Indians to react, or if it will play the traditional sort of restraining role, especially given how unstable Pakistan is.
Well, I think, for me, or my takeaway from this conversation really is that at this time when things seem peaceful and stable and heading in one direction, we just need to be extremely cognizant that it doesn't take a long time for events to spin in another direction altogether. I hope they won't, but having covered so many of these crises over these years, I guess I've learned to be prepared for them. Dr. Bacon, thank you so much for making the time to talk about this with us. Safe travels. I know you're wandering through a part of the world that can also be dangerous. And we look forward to having you back on the program with us one of these days. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This is great.